At the opening of the 18th century, the world was growing weary of war. The brutal rule of Spain had been overcome, and the aggressive ambition of Louis XIV was checked by the diplomatic skill of William of Orange, while the increasing sea power of Great Britain was beginning to balance the continent. The divine mission of Gratius in the previous century was bearing fruit, and though France and England contended here and there, these struggles were not wars of extermination. Forces other than warlike were getting exercise and practice, and where was the opportunity better than in a new world in Aquidneck, the Isle of Peace by the sea? Where did the new forms of civilization assert themselves better and in a more graceful form? New England was just passing out of the ebb. The later 17th century had not developed citizens equal to the pioneers who had led the way, but stronger men were coming. In the 80s, there was a marked increase of commerce, of which a large share came to Newport. With commerce came the opportunity for that expansion, which the conditions of the place greatly favored. In his century sermon of 1738, Callender cited Neal in the statement, "This is deservedly esteemed the paradise of New England for the fruitfulness of the soil and the temperateness of the climate." Enthusiasts for this landscape and climate have magnified and illumined their theme with every resource of rhetoric as time has gone on. It appeals to one's alertness rather than to a lazy receptivity. You miss its quality entirely if your faculties are not in a state of real activity. This does not exclude composure or imply excitement. In winter, there might be difference of opinion. Mr. George Bradford, a true lover of nature, told me there was all the capricious, beguiling promise of the New England spring, with double disappointments in effect. Yet a fine day can tempt a zealot in the wise. The lotus-eating season is over, plainly, yet there is the same agreeable absence of demand on any specific energies as in summer. The envelope of color, that delightful garment that Newport never puts off, is as evident to the senses as in midsummer, though more silvery in quality. Richard Greenough claimed it to be the American Venice, according to Dr. Hill. Newport furnished the colony with one of its best governors, Samuel Cranston, an officer who would have been eminent in any country. Chosen in 1698, and at 30 successive elections, he was probably longer in office than any man ever subjected to an annual popular election. It was a season of severe trial when the colony was exploring unknown paths of government, and the executive head was sorely tested. His just views and inflexible firmness kept his constituency well in hand and gave him deserved popularity. In the paper money vexation, he acted as best he could. Towards the opposing religious sects, he was judicial. He did not join or attend meeting with any sect, being, in the words of Dr. Turner, a keep-at-home Protestant, an impartial and good man. In his administration, the colony was threatened at home and abroad. He assured and protected the public weal. In 1708, as he reported to the Board of Trade, the commerce of Newport was growing, and after the Peace of Utrecht in 1713, it increased rapidly. The metropolis of the government then had a population of 2,203, about half as many again as the town of Providence. Conscious enlargement and the spirit of growth records itself in 1712, when John Mumford was ordered to survey the streets and number them. The town had grown to be the admiration of all and was the metropolitan, said the fond record. For the first 3 decades, the expanding community was being prepared for the event which was greatly to affect it, and to influence all New England. Reverend George Berkeley, Dean of Derry, had put forth his Principles of Human Knowledge in 1710. Flippant writers in these 2 centuries have laughed at the transcendent principles of Berkeley, but those laugh best who laugh last. The Dean only held firmly that the universally acknowledged ultimate cause cannot be the empty abstraction called matter. There must be living mind at the root of things. Mind must be the very substance and consistence and cause of whatever is. In recognizing this wondrous principle, life is simplified to man. Certainly the world of knowledge has moved towards, rather than away from, the philosopher since this was written. Here was the creative and impelling idea needed to lift commercial and material Newport out of pioneer life and into communion with an older civilization and a more refined culture. Berkeley, on his way to found a college at Bermuda, landed at Newport January 23, 1729, by accident or design, as is disputed, and remained there about 3 years. Reverend James Honeyman was preaching in Trinity Church, founded at the beginning of the century, when the letter from Dean Berkeley proposing to land was received. He read it to the congregation, dismissing them with a blessing. The pastor and flock repaired to the wharf in time for the landfall. In this dramatic manner, the ideas of the old world were received into the new. The philosopher confirms all our reports of the beauty and extraordinary progressive character of the place with its 6,000 inhabitants, the most thriving, flourishing place in all America for its bigness. We shall note the sectaries who agreed in a rage for finery, the men in flaming scarlet coats and waistcoats laced and fringed with brightest glaring yellow. The sly Quakers not venturing on these charming coats and waistcoats, yet loving finery, figured away with plate on their sideboards. Graduates from Harvard College were frequent, with an occasional native who had been educated at an English university. The girls were often sent to Boston for their schooling. Dissenters naturally attracted the notice of this good-humored ecclesiast. The inhabitants are of a mixed kind, consisting of many sorts and subdivisions of sects. Here are 4 sorts of Anabaptists, besides Presbyterians, Quakers, Independents, and many of no profession at all. Notwithstanding so many differences, here are fewer quarrels about religion than elsewhere, the people living peaceably with their neighbors of whatever profession. They all agree in one point, that the Church of England is second best. This accommodating spirit, noted by the Dean, was enforced in most piquant manner by Captain William Wanton, a Quaker and son of a preacher. He courted Ruth Bryant, the beautiful daughter of a Presbyterian deacon in Scituate, Massachusetts, who would not hear of such laxity in marriage, but the ardent groom solved the difficulty. Ruth, I am sure we were made for each other. Let us break away from this unreasonable bondage. I will give up my religion, and thou shalt give up thine, and we will go to the Church of England and the devil together. Lodowick Updike gives his boyish impression of the liberal dean in Trinity pulpit. All sects rushed to hear him. Even the Quakers, with their broad-brimmed hats, came and stood in the aisles. In one of his sermons, he very emphatically said, "Give the devil his due, John Calvin was a great man." Reverend James McSparran, settled at St. Paul's Church in Narragansett in 1721, was not as tolerant towards the pestilent heresy of the Quakers. He stated that there was no established religion, but the Quakers are, for the most part, the people in power. George Fox came in 1672 on his powerful mission. William Penn said of him that he was civil beyond all forms of breeding. His influence, working on the radical settlers of the island and their descendants, must have had gracious effect. Historians and critics rooted in the established order of the 16th and following centuries, when judging dissent, can only see jangling differences, for they are blindly unconscious of the indestructible elements of beauty growing out of freedom from arbitrary control in religious and social matters. Good Dean Berkeley cited 4 varieties of Anabaptists among his new friends and neighbors. Anabaptism simply meant the worst form of anarchy to an ordinary Catholic or Calvinist of the differing centuries. Yet the conservative Erasmus could term them a people against whom there is very little to be said. In some cases, goaded by severe laws, they were wild and fanatical, but were in general mystically sincere and pious. They were not necessarily historical Baptists, though the rite of baptism usually distinguished them. In the great social influences forming the Newport of mid-18th century, the literary and philosophical society with the Redwood Library were powerful factors. The first institution was formed in 1730, some claiming that it was originated by Berkeley. Mr. Mason, a competent and sympathetic authority, says it owed something of its influence to him, we may readily admit. But when he came to Newport, intellectually he found it no barren wilderness. The people were chosen and elect. Whether we consider Coddington, John Clark, and the disciples of Anne Hutchinson, or the friends of Roger Williams, or the converts of George Fox, or the enterprising spirits gathered into the most thriving place in all America. The Quaker Wanton and the High Puritan Ruth Bryant, molded into genial Episcopalians, were fair examples of this annealing culture. They had books already, as will be shown later, and representatives of all the sects. Jacob the Quaker Scientist, Collins and Ward, Seventh-day Sabbatarians, Callender, a Baptist, Leeming, a Congregationalist, the Episcopal Honeyman, and others banded together. There was an elaborate set of rules with forfeits and fines for all sorts of neglect and misfeasance, as was common then, some showing the earnest spirit of life prevailing. The society was to consider some useful question in divinity, morality, philosophy, history, etc., but nothing shall ever be proposed or debated which is a distinguishing religious tenet of any one member. Whoever shall make it an excuse to avoid giving his opinion that he has not thought of the question or has forgot what the question is, shall forfeit 1 shilling. Whoever is unprovided of a proper question on his turn to propound one shall forfeit 1 shilling. The first authentic paper is dated in 1735, though there must have been earlier examples. The society was conducted vigorously and continued until about 1747 and had some occasional members, among whom was Stephen Hopkins of Providence. Reverend Dr. Samuel Johnson, another participant, lived at Stratford, Connecticut. He was an ardent disciple of Berkeley, visiting him soon after his arrival. As he was invited to the rectorate of Trinity in 1750, it shows the permanence of Berkeley's influence in the colony. Afterwards, he was president of King's College, New York. Newport was a favorite destination for Scotch immigrants, and accordingly, their influence was strong in the community. We get an inkling of the relative importance of the port from this statement of Dr. Waterhouse. Between the years 1746 and 1750, there came over from Great Britain to the English colonies a number of Scotch gentlemen. Some settled in Philadelphia, some in New York, but the greater part sat down in that pleasant and healthy spot, Rhode Island.